I'm here today to talk about reading, because I think reading's having a crisis, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. We all regularly hear about problems with literacy, that is getting people to learn to read, but I think there's even a much bigger problem than that, and that is there are a large number of people who know how to read, but are now choosing not to read. In the United States, 33% of high school graduates and 42% of college graduates never read another book in their lifetime after graduation. And in the UK now, children are more likely to own a mobile phone than a book. How many of you parents in the audience are saying to your kids, you know, stop watching that television, get off the internet, stop texting your friends, get off that video game, and read a book? Because we all know that these video games and books are amazing, but would you be as proud if your 10-year-old son or daughter came to you and said, I've just finished reading a 300-page novel? How proud would you be then if they came to you and said, I've just finished playing the video game based on the book, or watched the movie based on the book? Because the reality is, these new entertainment experiences are amazing. They've got multi-billion-dollar budgets, and it's just very hard for reading to compete with them. But on the other hand, we know that there's something special about reading, because when we read, we can really get lost in a good book. So today, what I want to do is have a look at how does reading compete with this modern, multimedia and sensory world that we live in today. So let's have a look at reading. What is it about reading, for those who do read, that enjoy it so much? And the easiest way to explain it is reading can transport you to different worlds. And the way I like to explain it, and it's very unscientific, is reading accesses something called the inner imagination of your mind. And it's only through reading that we can get there. Almost no other entertainment medium can do the same thing, because when we read, we have to create it for ourselves in our own mind. And it changes for everybody depending on how long it takes us to get into the state of mind. For some, it can be reading a line, others a chapter. Depends if you're in a busy or quiet environment, or the text might be very hard, or maybe you've just had a really, really tough day and you're trying to forget about everything that you've got going on. But the reality is, once you're in this state of mind, it's an amazing experience, and reading is very, very enjoyable. So what we first have to do to address the problem with reading, or people reading, is make the inner imagination of the mind more accessible. So our research next focused on what else could we look at that has a similar emotional response on our brains as it's in the same way when we read and we access this inner imagination of the mind. And the answer when we looked at it was obvious, especially for younger people, and that was music. Because music evokes emotion in our brains like nothing else. And the best example for this is a film. If you think about it, when you're watching a film, if you hear music like this, you're instantly going to think suspense. And now it's sadness, adventure, or humor. The reality is, if you take away the sound from the film, almost all of the emotion dies with the film at the same time. How often have you been driving in the car somewhere and you hear a song come on the radio and it instantly transports you back to your teenage years? All of those emotions and memories come flooding back to you. That's the power of music. Or if you give an adult or a child a page of text and ask them to memorize it and then read it back to you in 10 minutes' time, few will be able to do it. But if you give them text like this and a song that goes with it, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this song, they could recite it back to you in 5 or 10 minutes easily. And if I remove this text from the screen now, I'm pretty sure almost everybody in this audience could sit down and write out the words, because that's the impact that music has on our memory and our emotional engagement. So our second main point we've got to consider with reading is whatever we do to it, we have to make sure we bring a more emotional engagement to the reading experience. So for more answers, we looked at what has happened with storytelling? What's the history of storytelling? So if we go back 10,000 years ago, stories used to be handed down from generation to generation around the campfire. The book, as we know it today, is only about 2,000 years old. Yet in the last 100 years, storytelling has had a massive disruptive change. It started out with the advent of radio, then black and white film, then we added sound, colour, and now we're up to 3D and who knows what's next. Reading, meanwhile, distribution has changed enormously. We can now carry an entire library around in our back pocket on our mobile phone, but yet the way we read 2,000 years ago on paper to the way we read today on a tablet or a phone has not changed. The medium may have changed, but we are still physically reading text just on different devices. And that's led to a lot of problems. In New Zealand now, in the 12 to 24-year-old age bracket, they spend on average 10 minutes per day reading, but 140 minutes per day watching television. In the United States in 2009, 80% of US families did not buy a book. But what's even more concerning, and we're seeing this pattern emerge all around the world now, is children are turned off reading for pleasure by the time they're leaving primary school. So they're getting to 10, 11 years old and they're checking out from reading. They've had enough. And I really think that's a massive problem for society, something that we really need to address, and we need some real answers. So what was seen as the saviour for all of this was actually books going electronic. We now had tablets and devices that we could now bring this multimedia world into reading. And in a few areas, it's proven to do very well. For example, in preschool, before children know how to read, it's been very popular. And in instructional books, where you can add a video on how to bake a cake or play golf. But on the other side, this new area called enhanced books has been a spectacular failure. And the reason is, when you read a book, you get into this deeper level imagination of the mind state. And then what you have to do is come out of that to watch that video or play that game, and then get back into that to enjoy reading again. And it amounts to just one word, and that is distraction. So the third and final part we have to bring to reading is make sure it provides immersion and not distraction from reading. So if we look at our checklist, how does reading compete with this modern multimedia and sensory world we live in today? We have to access the inner imagination, we have to bring more emotional engagement, and we have to provide immersion in the reading experience. And I'm proud to announce that we have invented exactly the solution to this right here in New Zealand, and it is adding a soundtrack to a book. But it's not just any soundtrack, it's a synchronized soundtrack. It learns what you're reading, when you're reading, and adapts the soundtrack to match. If you're reading about a scene, it'll create the environmental sounds for the scene you're reading. It'll produce the sound effects that match the events happening in the scene, and then it will bring music in that brings emotion to the experience. And the core part about the technology, it's a bit like having a composer arrange the perfect soundtrack to match what you're reading when you read the book. So I'll just give you an example. If you're reading about a book and it's a scene and it's on the beach, this is what you'd hear. And you're reading that the heroine is running along the beach, and then all of a sudden, from out of the shadows, a man appears with a gun and fires the gun. It's very sad now because the heroine is dying, so the sad music kicks in. We've called this many, many different things. It started out calling a book score, a soundtrack for a book, but what we've called it is a book track, combining book and soundtrack. And we think it's a really good name for what we are creating, which is a new genre of digital entertainment content. What I'd like to do now is just show you an example of this. This is a book that we did called In the South. It's a book by Salman Rushdie. The score for the book was composed by New Zealand renowned composer John Pathasis, who's in the audience today. It was recorded by the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and all the sound was produced and mixed at Park Road Post Productions, same company that have brought us the Lord of the Rings sound and other famous movies. I'm just going to give you a little demo and talk through it, and then I'll give you an example you can look at for yourself. So what you can see on the screen here is it just looks like a normal e-reader. The main difference is you're hearing sound, and you can see on the right-hand side there's a little triangle which shows you the pace that we've measured your reading at, and that'll adapt depending on as you read. And you can turn the display of that on or off, and most people just leave it off and read and enjoy the experience. If you want to reread a part of the book, you can just, as it's shown here, you can just double click on a word and the soundtrack will automatically synchronize back in with whatever part of the book you're reading. You can also adjust the mix of the soundtrack. So if you think, I like it, but the music's too loud for me, you can turn it down. Or you can bring the music up and drop the ambient sound down. The core part of our technology is matching to the way you are reading with your reading speed to the soundtrack as you are reading. And what I'd like to do now is just play for you about 45 seconds of an example from the same book. And in this scene, it's a scene when the tsunami's hitting the coastline. And it is set at a set reading speed, so it's not going to match to your individual reading speeds. But you can see from the triangle down the side, where an average reading speed would sit. And please enjoy. So if you look at that soundtrack now and marry that up with our criteria that I came up with, that is, we need to access the inner imagination of the mind. One of the comments we keep getting back about our soundtracks is people that say they used to read a lot, but today they're just too busy, they've got too much going on in their minds, but when they read with a synchronized soundtrack, it shuts out the outside world, it enables them to focus on their book, get into the book quicker, and stay there longer. So it's solving one of the problems to get into that inner imagination of the mind state. And the other point is it brings more emotional engagement. I've now put up the same text up there, and if you read a section of it now without the soundtrack, there's nowhere near the emotion. That's not one of our sound effects, by the way. And I think that's a really key part, is we know music brings emotion to everything in our lives. What we are doing is just bringing that to the reading experience. And then finally, we have to be able to make sure that what we're doing has an immersive quality. Booktrack is the only enhancement to reading that's delivered to you while you read. Every other enhancement takes you out of the reading experience to give it to you before you have to get back into it. So 12 months ago, we pushed this out into the market and we got a reaction. And the reaction was quick and it was global. It went very quickly all around the world. People called it many different things. The future of reading, an advance in publishing, or just a fun way to read. Many said it transformed their reading experience. And the users loved it. Our Twitter feed is constantly alight with all different languages of the world talking about the amazing experiences that they're having, and they're asking for more content now. And there's been some certain markets that have popped up, like the commuter market, who are already used to reading with a soundtrack while they commute. They read a book, they push play on their playlist, then they're just doing it in an unsynchronized manner at the moment. So with Booktrack, they can now bring those different senses together, and it's proving to be very popular with that market. But there were also some that said, perhaps the author's words are enough and we should just leave it at that. So there was a variety of different responses. But the point I want to make here is the first quote is about Booktrack, but the second quotes are from 1928 when sound was added to film. Time magazine called the effect startling and annoying. And I think today, it's very hard to imagine a film without sound, but in 1928, that was a reality. And when they added sound to film, it was not very popular. And the reason is, it was disruptive. It was establishing a new market and value network, and it was polarizing and paradigm shifting. And it's the same with Booktrack. You've got to make your own mind up for it. You've got to try it for yourself. And before you make your mind up, just remember next time you go see a film, if you're happy to sit there and turn the sound down or not. One of the questions we often get asked, though, what about the effect on learning? How could this have an impact on education? So a New York University professor approached us and asked to do a study on it, Leo Lebrovitz. And he said it proved categorically a significant increase in comprehension and retention when read with a soundtrack as opposed to when read without a soundtrack. So that's an area we're extraordinarily excited about and really looking forward to working with local universities to explore that further now. So back to the problem I outlined right at the beginning, and that is, the problem is not that people are not learning to read, it is that they are not continuing to read. We believe that adding a synchronized soundtrack to text and combined with the really, really cool text, the cool tech that we've got today in tablets and mobile phones is a solution to that problem. And how we're going to do that is we're going to make the tech available to everybody. All the tools we've created to synchronize soundtracks with any text, it could be a blog, it could be a letter, it could be a book, we're going to put that in the hands of children, audio professionals and non-professionals and amateurs and authors. Kids could have a school project where they can write their own story and then add their own soundtrack with it and share it with mum and dad and their class and their families. Because we really believe that the future of reading has to be important to us, and we believe that through making the tools available far and wide for anyone to create a soundtrack for any text, it's going to inspire a new generation of readers to dream again and read again and hear the future of reading. Thank you.